Yeah. Okay.
All right. Hi, everybody. I think we'll get started. Can everybody hear me okay? All right. Hi, my name is Rob Scher. I'm a member of the Board of Selectmen and kind of like the board's informal liaison to the Upper Charles Trail Committee, as a member of that as well. So thank you all for being here tonight. This is, I guess, is it the third and last routing alignment study? This is kind of like the final draft kind of presentation that's going to be made to you tonight. And there still will be an opportunity for feedback both tonight and through our email, which will be given out as always. So I just wanted to take a moment to introduce some of the town officials that are here tonight. And start. And it's the other background, just to remind everybody, the Upper Charles Trail Committee is a creation of the Ashland Board of Selectmen, who have been very supportive and have really been a large driving force behind this. So I wanted to acknowledge members that are here. Some members are not here because there's an important planning board meeting tonight, but I see Steve Mitchell is here. Steve, I don't know if you want to raise your hand. Yolanda Greaves just walked in. Our town manager, Mike Herbert, is here. And I think I see Doug Small back there as Public Works Director, which is, they might be doing some work on this trail, so that's good that he's here. So, and I did want to thank Sheila Page, our town planner, for her work. I don't think she's here tonight, but she's been very helpful, and it's great to have the planners involved. The assistant town planner, Josh Chase, is here. Josh, just raise your hand. He's back in the back there. So anyway, so without further ado, I just want to thank you all for coming here. Look at the maps, get your input, ask your questions. Hopefully, the committee has been working very hard for the last 2+ years, and this is the fruit of that labor. And so I'm going to turn it over, hopefully briefly, to Joel Arbeitman. Was Joel, who's the chair of the Upper Charles Trail Committee. He's going over his notes. So anyway, so Joel, you want to come up here? And thank you.
Thanks, Robin. Thanks, everyone, for being here. It's a great turnout. We're really pleased about that. Rob talked, the committee actually has been impaneled by the Board of Selectmen almost 3 years now. So we've been working for quite a while behind the scenes, trying to put together a plan and try to figure out how to make all of this work for the, to get the trail built. Prior to that, however, our job was to try to enlist the support of the selectmen and enlist the support of the planning board. And as part of the Ashland Bike Club that I'm very involved with, we 4 years ago, this was back in 2013, took a survey. We went to had a booth at Ashland Day in Stone Park. And what we did was we basically just asked every person walking by the booth if they would come over and take a general survey on walking and biking in Ashland. So I wanted to just share some of the results with you. I find some of them really startling. The first question is, do you think Ashland is generally a safe place to walk and bike? And 37 people said yes, 65 people said no. We got a lot of feedback about the lack of sidewalks, off-road paths, and things of that nature. Sidewalks were a very dominant issue in some of the comments that were made. Secondly, I'm not going to read all these, but a few of them really stand out. Would you like to see Ashland invest in making both walking and biking safer? 109 people said yes, no one said no. Would you like to see Ashland increase the number of sidewalks around town? 106 yes, 1 said no. Would you like to see Ashland build paved, off-road, multi-use paths that could be used for walking and jogging, biking, rollerblading, skateboarding, and other non-motorized recreational uses? Yes, 107, no, 2. So there was very strong support for moving ahead with this project, and I think the selectmen were very responsive to our request to form a committee and to start working on the details of how to make all of this happen. And so after a couple of years of discussions and plannings and walking all over the town trying to find the best way to do this, we decided that the next best step, because we didn't have engineering expertise or landscape architecture expertise, was to bring in a consulting firm, and we went about interviewing a number of firms, and we brought in Alta Planning and Design and Kleinfelder to work with us on trying to figure out whether a trail in Ashland would be feasible. And so, without further ado, the consultants have completed most of their work at this point, and I'm hoping they can let us know whether they think, after having studied Ashland extensively for almost, I guess it's been about 9 months or so, whether a trail in Ashland is feasible. We all want it. The question is, can it be done? So without further ado, here is Phil Goff from Alta Planning and Design.
Thanks, Joel. Appreciate the introduction, and maybe a little round of applause for Joel and the Upper Charles Trail Committee. Members are very committed to this project. I mean, I do a lot of planning in various communities really throughout New England, and it's always a treat to work in a community with very committed and community members who are part of a committee that's been going for this many years. That really puts a lot of time. These guys are meeting every other week for typically 3 hours. I've been to some of those 3-hour meetings or beyond that end at 10 o'clock, so I know what it's like. So thanks for all that work. And there's actually a whole bunch of other people. Whoops. I'll get to that slide. I wanted to acknowledge a number of other people too in a slide that's coming up. But it's been great working on this project for the past 9 months. Want to also introduce, I've been the project manager on this project, but Charlie Cray, you could raise your hand, who works with Alta Planning and Design, has done a lot of the kind of day-to-day planning and mapping and a lot of the graphics that you're going to see in your hand right now and what you'll see later tonight. Charlie has done most of those. He's done a great job. And then Mike Cunningham with Kleinfelder, which is the sub-consulting engineers who have done a lot of the environmental research and analysis that appears in the report. The report is in draft. It's a final draft report at this point, and will be made available sometime next week for people to review. But for all intents and purposes, just about everything in the report is encapsulated in some way, shape, or form here in the presentation tonight. So this is really our recommendation of well, first of all, the feasibility question that Joel brought up, which is, of course, a good one, which I'll answer, and then sort of get into issues of the routing and how we think it would make the most sense and what the character of that trail would be. So I guess to answer Joel's question, which is a good question, and the sort of core of why you hire folks to come in and do a feasibility study is to determine, yes, after the analysis that we have done, hearing from community members, meeting with various stakeholder groups, town staff, different town committees and commissions, we have determined that yes, a trail is certainly feasible. That's the good news. And most of what you're going to hear tonight is good news for sure. The trail from end to end is 8.3 miles. Taking it, as the crow flies, it might be more like 5 or 6, but it takes some jogs along the way. It incorporates both state and town-owned property, so that's good. We all know that this isn't as simple as some other communities that have old abandoned rail lines and nice flat rail beds to incorporate on a trail. This is a lot more complex. In fact, I would say of the numerous communities I've worked on in the 10 or so years I've been doing trail planning and design, this is probably the most complex job that I've ever done. But it's been a very interesting one, and I think the potential here is really quite great. What we've recommended and determined to be feasible is that trail to be primarily an off-road trail. We know that that is important to a lot of folks in the community and on the committee, that you have a separated trail away from traffic that's off-road. There are certainly a handful of places which you'll see later on where the trail route does use some lower volume local residential streets as well. And we also have some to form a loop and make a connection to downtown and all the businesses and the civic institutions there, some on-street facilities in the downtown area as well. Also good news, negotiations and discussions have already begun with a handful of property owners in different parts of the alignment. not including, of course, discussions that have already occurred with DCR and MassDOT and others on the possibility of routing the trail within state parkland, which I'll get into a little bit later. And part of the scope of work in which we've been hired is to do a order of magnitude cost estimate for the trail. So for the 8.3 miles, the construction cost came in at roughly about $8 million based on our estimate for an average of about $1 million a mile. I know that sounds like a lot, and that's, $1 million is a lot per mile, but I can tell you that in the work that I've done elsewhere, $1 million a mile is not unusual, especially in a complex corridor that's incorporating a whole different variety of context in order to complete the trail, as opposed to just a sort of simple rail trail, which usually comes in significantly lower. So that's all the good news, but we know that there's challenges, and I think it's probably relatively obvious to people that there are some challenges, and those need to be looked at and studied further. Wetland, there are a few spots where there's some significant wetlands, but not unattainable to actually route a trail through them. We've met with the Conservation Commission locally. There was no major red flags from the Conservation Commission. There's certainly the recognition that some significant permitting and perhaps some mitigation would be required, but that boardwalk segments of the trail are certainly possible in pretty much all of the wetland sections that we have portions of the trail. We know fundraising, like in any community, is a challenge, and it's something that will be ongoing, and I think that there'll be some reliance on partnering with MassDOT and DCR and state agencies to get grant money, and that will be ongoing. And the coordination with other towns, this is part of a 5-town, 25-mile loop, and the good news there is that some communities are, in essence, already done, like Milford, and some of you have probably been on the rail trail there. But there have been discussions that we've had, certainly with Hopkinton, which is where our trail alignment needs to really kind of connect most closely. And there have been representatives from Hopkinton here at our meetings. We've met with them personally, and we know that they're moving forward on some of their planning as well. So that's the summary of the feasibility study in a quick nutshell. But of course, I want to provide much more detail. But before that, the acknowledgements that I guess Rob already began with, mentioning Town of Ashland's staff and elected representatives and officials who are already here, but also wanted to acknowledge some of the folks, some of the committees that we had met with. I mentioned Conservation Commission, but we had also met with school committee members, with the school superintendent, as well with planning board members, open space and recreation committee members, and of course I'd mentioned DCR and MassDOT folks. The Upper Charles Trail committee members have pretty much already been recognized, and of course the Board of Selectmen have been very supportive of this whole process, and we wouldn't be here certainly without them. And of course all of you, and I see lots of familiar faces. I've been here enough that good number of you look like you've been here before. Just raise your hands if you've been to all 3 of the meetings, because I know a bunch of you have, or at least, and then hands for have been at least at one other meeting. All right, so probably half of you have been to at least 1 or 2 of the meetings, which is great. So I'll jump in, and the presentation will be brief on the options and the evaluation criteria, because that was really what was covered in the earlier meetings, the first meeting that we had in the winter and the second meeting on June 1st, and then get into really the core trail recommendations, talk a little bit about the character and some of the design issues, and then of course wrap up with next steps. And unlike the other meetings that we've had previously, we will not be breaking out into smaller groups. It's not a roll up your sleeves work session because of the stage that we're at least in this part of the planning process, but we're happy to stay until 9 and have a great discussion and take your questions later after the next step section. And just a reminder, as I mentioned before, that the Upper Ashland, or the Upper Charles Trail in Ashland is part of a 5-town, larger Upper Charles Trail Loop, that's 25 miles, through Sherburne and Holliston, Milford, where the trail's already done, and Hopkinton. And the Ashland is a kind of a key 7 or 8 mile piece that's, of course, part of that. So when we looked at the trail routing options, we, as a consulting team and working with the committee, we looked at just about every possible route to get from point A, which in our case, we generally go from west to east. So our mission was to try to get from Hopkinton State Park in the west to pretty much the east end of the Dyke Trail to the east. So we looked at pretty much every conceivable on-street and off-road connection between the two. Looked at many of them. Some of them we could quickly, with the committee's help, rule them out. But others, we then narrowed down to 8 different potential ways to get from point A to point B, and did our evaluation process, breaking it down between the sort of 3 segments, the west, central, and east parts of Ashland. So the criteria that we use to evaluate the various options to get to the recommendation that you're looking at today, that I'll describe in more detail later. We had 8 different criteria. With the committee's help, we determined which ones we thought were those that could be weighted a little more heavily. Those that, the 4 below, trail safety, linkages to destinations, visibility and access, and user experience, were thought to be more important or doubly weighted because those are criteria that will be part of the trail indefinitely, in essence, forever. Whereas community support, ease of construction, property access, permitting requirements are important, of course, but those are more short-term related issues that when the trail is built, those are no longer there. So that helped to explain our desire to sort of weight some of the post-implementation criteria more heavily. And in doing that process and in looking at the sort of narrowed list of 8 different options, and then scoring them, 1 through 5, up to 5 points for each of the 8 criteria. Actually, it must have been more than 5 because one of them is 45. Must have been up to 8 points for each criteria. Oh no, it was 1 through 5, but some of them are doubled, of course. So the way the different options were scored didn't exactly, lead directly to our recommendation, but it helped to inform that decision. Simply because we needed to put additional input from the community, from committee members, and from additional field work that we were doing. So the evaluation matrix that we used and that methodology, it doesn't lead to, it's not an inflexible approach that says, okay, this is the one you're going to go with, but it helps to inform. So that gives you a sense of where we led throughout most of the analysis stage of this project, to get to a point where our primary recommendation, at least kind of cryptically here, we're showing on the sort of west end that connecting to the Hopkinton State Park as the Whittemore route because it connects to a piece of Whittemore Drive. In the center, the sort of key recommendation is the Ashland State Park route because it incorporates a route through the state park and on top of the reservoir dam, with then a secondary loop to connect to downtown, to connect to the businesses and institutions there. And then on the east side, the route that, based on the scoring and other input, we decided to move forward with, we call it the Dyke Trail route because it connected directly to the Dyke Trail. For those really interested and into this kind of topographical issue and are curious about, well, if you're going from one end to the other, how hilly is that going to be? We know it's not just a flat rail, old rail bed, like I've said a couple times. There are certainly some hills in there, and we sort of decided to look at some of the topography just to give you a sense if you were kind of going to take a slice from end to end, from west to east, what that might look like in some of the hills involved. So starting at Hopkinton State Park, and in that part of the west segment, it's relatively flat. There's a bit of a hill getting up to Whittemore Drive, and then the rail transit district, big apartment and condo development. As you know, that's a relatively sizable hill in which you. That says it's 300, 400. So, this is probably down 250 up to maybe 400 feet. So you have that vertical rise. Thank you. And then coming down the hill, and then obviously it flattens out at the reservoir dam. And then the other hill of significance is really, as part of the alignment, is getting from Main Street, where the trail crosses Main Street, and then along the edge of the cemetery, Wildwood Cemetery, and then up to the high school, and then back down. So that's what these kind of two most significant hills in the alignment are. But that was something we certainly wanted to be cognizant of. Did someone have a quick clarification question? Yeah.
Yeah, what's the maximum grade, what's the average grade?
That's a great question. I don't have the precise answer to either of those, but we do know that that ultimately this trail, in all likelihood, of course, through final design as necessary, would be an ADA accessible trail. So most parts of the trail will be at a 5% grade, but what is allowed within ADA and trail design is you can have shorter segments up to 8% or even up to very short segments up to even 12%. So where you're seeing those hills there, that's not to say that the trail is literally going to follow that grade, which is probably more of a 10% grade. Where you have those hills, there definitely is the need for some switchbacks and some other regrading in order to ensure that you have a smoother route from top to bottom. That's a great question. So I'm, again, going to walk through in a little more detail, and some of the graphics you'll see on the screen are certainly similar to what you have in your hands, but that's only a portion of the different plan and 3D graphics that we've developed. So starting in the west segment, or what we call the Whittemore route, this is Hopkinton State Park here. The parking lot is kind of in this area, and the beach is in that area there. This is Howe Street and Cross Street. So the first part, I'll kind of cartoon it out, and then we have these, you can see these boxes are insets where we zoom in even closer, and I can describe how the trail in more detail even will be getting through some of these difficult stretches. So, but generally in this kind of third, the western third, starting at Hopkinton State Park, we have a side path, an off-road path that runs basically right adjacent to Howe Street, all state land here, and then crossing into big Indian reservation land. There's a Boy Scout camp that's kind of in that zone, but our preferred route is kind of running through that property, through an easement that's already been established at this Whittemore development area here. There's already a portion of an easement, and then some town-owned property in order to get to Whittemore Drive, where I'll show you more detail later, widening of the sidewalk, and then connecting to the Rail Transit District property. So just zooming in a little more to that area near Hopkinton State Park. Adjacent to the park, and we've met with DCR, a handful of us from the committee and the town and consultants met with DCR, and DCR is quite supportive of the trail along, adjacent to, and even through the two state parks in question here. So that was very encouraging to us. So in meeting with DCR and talking about different alignments that they felt comfortable with, we looked at an alignment along Howe Street that could be a path just right adjacent to the road. There's space within the right of way, but in further negotiation and planning with DCR, that trail may actually be on the other side of the fence. You can see this photo. There's the chain link fence there, and this is the soccer field, play fields in the park. We would certainly want to discuss with them the possibility the trail could actually be in the park. But a worst case scenario, there's space within the right of way to put the trail along Howe Street here. You'd have an at-grade crossing of Howe Street, and then continuing on to the Big Indian Reservation property. And then as the trail alignment moves further east and connects to Whittemore Drive, we wanted to illustrate the crossing of Whittemore Drive and High Street to the RTD land.
Excuse me.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Back, if, I live right near the big Indian area there.
Okay.
I noticed that it looks like you're adding another bridge, you're cutting another trail through there.
Yes, thank you. That was that's a detail I neglected to mention, but a good one. So, this is still to be determined, precisely what the trail alignment is through that Big Indian Head Reservation land. We do understand that the Boy Scout camping area here, that we don't want to bring the trail like right into the camping area. And the existing bridge, which is right there, is very close to that camping area. And we also, we want to be wary of and cognizant of being too close to some of the other homes and parcels on the edge here. Looks like we lost the tape. Charlie, if I could ask you to come up and maybe, or Mike, can you fix that tape a little bit? We might need another piece of duct tape to get that sheet up there tight. So in order to create a little more breathing room to the camping area, our initial recommendation is to bring the trail a little bit south along Indian Brook and then have a new bridge. It would be obviously a short bridge. It's not a wide stream.
That area
Yep.
there is all wooded now. And
Yep.
There's already a heavily traveled path right there.
Yeah.
So it seems like, that would be a good place to be.
Okay, that's a great comment.
Because like you said, you want to keep it away from the homes on that side.
Yep.
And that's pushing it right in my back.
Yep.
Whereas
Yep.
the Boy Scout camp, it's used, but not like all the time.
Yep.
They go in there 4 times a year.
Yep. We'll note that. I think that's a great comment. Again, we want
And that bridge was all.
to try to make everyone happy in
Phil,
this
can
site.
I just clarify that
Yeah.
the trustees of Big Indian have not given us permission, they have not agreed to this, so.
That's right.
We should just be clear of that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we may be in an alternative phase.
Yep. So this is based on our analysis, our recommendations. Everything you see here, about 40% of the whole 8-mile alignment actually does run through private property. And 60% is either on public land, state land, town-owned land, or in public rights-of-way. So there have been, as I mentioned before, there have some discussions with some of those property owners have been initiated, but nothing has been finalized. So again, this is just our alignment recommendation based on our experience and analysis, but none of these are set in stone yet. We do have actually 2 alternatives.
We need people to talk to the mic, so tell them to raise their hands and not forget.
Oh, okay. Thank you. We want to get for the record these questions taped, so we're going to, for those that have burning questions, and that was a great one, we have a mic to bring around. But I did want to, and it's great that you brought up the question, because knowing that this was private property and there's some possibility perhaps that alignment may not work, we do have 2 alternates that really incorporate more public right-of-way in order to make the connection to a point where we can get to an already established easement that the town has created. So we do have that, and you can see it on your map in that area too. Yes, sir, and you'll get the microphone, please.
Can you back up one slide? The previous one.
Oh,
With the Boy Scouts.
move forward.
He'll take the
Okay,
microphone.
yep,
Sorry.
yep, that's right.
Has anyone considered the gas line right away as a possible trail path? It has quite a width to it
Yeah.
compared to where the lines are actually buried.
We looked, there's a gas pipeline alignment you see here. When we were out with, that would primarily impact the part of the trail on the west side of Cross Street, whereas the Big
Yes.
Indian property is on the east. We looked at that, we walked that with DCR, and because of DCR's relatively enthusiastic response to the possibility that it could be closer to the park, that actually would connect trail users right into the beach area, and that there could be some kind of trailhead in there, that we really moved more over to run closer to the park formally. And also, we also looked at, we thought that the impact to trees and other natural corridor in order to sort of make the connection was significant as well.
Because I saw you
Yep.
have to add a new bridge anyways over Indian Brook.
Yep.
So if you came down that and then dropped across, you could actually come right out into the back gate of the state park.
Yep, that is possible. And these were some of the alignment options that have been investigated throughout the process. So, okay, I talked about that. Moving forward, moving east and providing the connection from the trail area near Hopkinton State Park and the Big Indian Reservation land to the rail transit district development site up on the hill. We're crossing at High Street as the widened sidewalk makes a little jog to move further east. And that really brings us into what we're sort of defining as the central portion of the alignment. So our primary recommendation, as I mentioned before, is that the trail cross High Street, the High Street crossing is here, and then up towards the condo and apartment development site here. Because of some topographical issues, we kind of wind around a little bit of the hill, and then we run along a portion of the pipeline easement that runs on the south end of that development. Where that then intersects the MBTA access road, which I'm sure you're all aware, there's all kinds of construction going on there. When that roadway is redone, there will be a 10-foot wide path that's separated from traffic. That's on the south side, which is really a great facility that we're certainly leveraging and taking advantage of. So the route at that point then the primary recommended route swings to the south, runs along that, what we're going to call, at least for all intents and purposes, existing, because in a few months that path will be done. So along that path down to West Union Street. We do have a little spur trail that we're showing that provides a connection to the front door of the Ashland Middle School, which we thought was important to provide that connection for the school kids and for others. And then the crossing of West Union, and then through Ashland State Park, which I'll show you in a bit more detail here. So the route through Ashland State Park, again, a part of this was, or a big part of the alignment here was based on our discussions with DCR and their level of support for the concept of having the Upper Charles Trail run through the park. It's certainly not unprecedented. DCR has a number of other regional and townwide city trails and shared use paths that run through its state parks. There's certainly a permitting process that needs to happen. And in fact, we've already submitted our preliminary application, and DCR is now going through the initial environmental, traffic-related, and archaeological evaluation at the preliminary level, which is required in order to make it to the next step. We're actually doing the permitting. So we are in that process now. So we wanted to sort of get out of the gate quickly with DCR, because we know that can be sometimes a cumbersome process, but especially when we're going through a part of the state park that we know has some significant wetlands, and the need for permitting will be quite great. So, but the general route that runs through, there's the crossing of West Union Street, and then a trail will run just to the north of existing Voyagers Lane, which is a private road into this condo development. We would be adjacent to that, but on the property immediately adjacent, so not within that right of way. And then the route would go around the southern or easternmost buildings in order to connect to an existing sort of maintenance roadway or path, sort of dirt road that exists already through the park here. And this is, DCR thought that worked out very well to connect our path and sort of double it up with that dirt road that's through there. And then a little spur to this adjacent street, and then crossing the reservoir dam, of course, on the existing path. So that path, you already saw that image, but the path is already there. There would be some improvements, a bit of widening. Certainly the most significant part of making the reservoir dam path a real part of the Upper Charles Trail would be to replace the bridge, very narrow footbridge over the spillway would need to be wider, at least 8 or probably 10 feet wide to accommodate the trail. but that gives you a sense of the character of just, that would be really a real highlight of the trail for sure. I'm sure many of you have been out there. It's really, really quite beautiful. As the trail then turns to the north in order to get up to Main Street and beyond, there, as soon as it gets to the base of the spillway, you pretty much need to have a pretty long segment, about a 2,500 foot length segment of boardwalk in order to get above the wetlands. Not impossible, definitely some significant expense, definitely some permitting required, perhaps some mitigation, but not impossible. And in fact, this gives you another view of the dam, the spillway, the trail that would cross the spillway, kind of wind around here. And then as it gets to the base of the spillway, would be mostly on boardwalk, pretty much following that alignment to Main Street. So the good news there is that this is something that is not out of the question for DCR. In fact, it was just maybe 4 or 5 years ago that DCR built a similar facility that was about 2,500 foot in length. That was primarily a stretch of boardwalk along Alewife Brook in Arlington, which is, I live actually about a mile from here. It's just a great facility, very popular, really cleaned up the area as well, because it was prior to the trail and the boardwalk going in. It was definitely used, there were small encampments, homeless encampments on occasion. Back in there, it was poorly maintained, there's lots of trash. Now with the trail and people using that part of the trail, it's really sort of transformed that part of Alewife Brook. So again, good news is this is something DCR has done. There was certainly some significant cost, but it's not unheard of to have this kind of facility in Ashland State Park. So we're enthused about that. Yes, question, sir, and I don't know where the microphone is. Oh, you've got the mic. Great.
It's pretty obvious that the red and blue colors are paved sections. The green off-road sections kind of bounce around between cinder, boardwalk, and I'm not sure where they're getting paved. Is it possible to show what those 3 sections are like when they're going to be off-road? What are you hoping to pave? What are you hoping to go cinder? What are you going to do boardwalk? Yeah. And show that on the map so that it's easier to understand how it's going to transition throughout the trail?
That's a great question. I will, at the end of the presentation, I'll get into trail character, and I'll show you, at least as a cross-section and a photo image of what the different trail characters are, paved versus a stone dust, more natural surface trail. Most parts of the trail, except in the more environmentally sensitive zones or places where the trail is truly going through a pretty sort of dense wooded area, those areas, the expectation and the recommendation is that you would stick with more of a natural surface trail. You'd still have your 10 feet, so it is more of a shared use path, and you'd keep grades. A stone dust surface, as long as the grades are correct, is still an ADA surface, so that's the good news about that. So wherever it's going through parts, private properties that are heavily wooded, perhaps parts of the state park, and DCR weighed in on that. We asked them about that. We had anticipated that they just wanted all natural surface to fit into more of the character. In fact, they said in the environmentally sensitive zones, perhaps, but in places where there is concern about erosion and washout, that it's actually better for them and much easier to maintain a paved surface. So it's still up in the air. It will require some planning and negotiating with DCR and their maintenance folks. But the anticipation is certainly in the environmentally sensitive zones, you'd have the natural surface. In fact, a lot of the parts of the portions of the trail through the more environmentally sensitive zones will in fact be boardwalks. So there will be that aesthetic as well. Okay, so I kind of described roughly the alignment, the route through Ashland State Park. And let me just go back to this one. So, that boardwalk piece up to Main Street, there would need to be obviously an at-grade crossing at Main Street, and then connecting over to between Main Street and Chestnut, which is up here. It would run along this parcel. There is a portion of that parcel has a sort of a raised area that was an old sewer alignment that elevates the trail sort of above any wet areas. We would likely take advantage of that. And that would bring the trail up basically to Chestnut Street. So Chestnut, we know that there's definitely some traffic volume and speeding that we need to take into account. So we'd want to have a special crossing treatment there to get to Wildwood Cemetery. But here we'd have the connection through, and I'll show you another graphic that kind of shows how we get around the edge of the cemetery, but then also bike lanes where there's some space to connect into downtown. Yeah, question in the back.
Yeah, is the trail going to be maintained year-round, or in the winter are you going to let it freeze over? And what's Hopkinton and Sherburne going to do?
The issue of seasonality of the trail is still to be determined. I mean, a lot of that will need to be discussed and finalized by the town, depending on maintenance needs and funding opportunities, and whether there's a real desire to keep some portions of it perhaps natural with snow for skiing, but then other portions that might provide, say, a key connection to a school, for instance, that perhaps would be plowed, but that's basically to be determined. And then the second part of the question was coordination with Hopkinton. Is that what you had asked?
Yeah, Hopkinton and Sherburne.
Yep.
They're going to, like out west, they have problems with the trail in Amherst and Northampton. Amherst, I think, plows their trail during the winter, and then Amherst all of a sudden doesn't do anything.
Okay.
It makes it impossible to use. I mean,
Okay.
the skiers are upset and the bike riders are upset.
Yep.
Because nobody wins.
Yep. So the question was coordination related to snow clearance
Yes.
specifically. That we haven't broached that topic. We've had meetings with other communities, and that level of detailed maintenance hasn't come up, but it's certainly a good one. Okay, Milford. Okay, so currently this portions of the trail in Milford and Holliston are not being plowed. And part of that might be funding, part of that might be just, wanting to maintain it as a snowy surface for skiers. I know I mentioned I live in Arlington, the Minuteman Path, which runs through Arlington, Lexington, Bedford, for almost since day one. Lexington has always plowed their path, but Arlington didn't for various reasons, mostly funding, to be honest. But the pressure built so much from advocates and others who wanted to walk and bike to Alewife Station and to other areas that the town found the funding, and now Arlington, Lexington, and Bedford all plow pretty much simultaneously. So you have at least from a walking, running, and biking point of view, a nice clear surface throughout the year. And I'm sure some skiers are not so happy with that, but that's how it was resolved, at least on the Minuteman Trail. So that sort of brings the route, at least through the central section, to Wildwood Cemetery. Wildwood Cemetery, where it's a town-owned property, so we certainly wanted to leverage that as an opportunity to bring at least a portion of the trail and not have the need for purchasing private land, easements, etc. We, of course, in our planning, we're very sensitive to the context of the historic cemetery, the fact that there are funerals there, that on Memorial Day, it becomes a sacred space, and perhaps other days. So we wanted to stay clear of kind of the formal area of the cemetery in which there were grave sites, but wanted to, at the same time, take advantage of some of the town-owned land. So the trail kind of comes in and crosses at Chestnut and runs along the sort of far west edge. We recommended finding, in essence, the sweet spot between the western or northwesternmost driveway, and there are no grave sites to the west of that roadway, which is good. Be between that and the river. So, the character of that area kind of looks like this, at least in that wintertime shot. So there would be some portions of that part of the trail on the edge of the cemetery that are likely to be up on piles as a boardwalk component, because there definitely are some wetland areas there, but that's to be determined. But in order to then connect up to the high school, and as someone had asked before, and we realized it's about, I think it was 120 feet or so to get up there, there would need to be some significant switchback at the northern extents of the cemetery, in order to get the elevation or enough linear length of the trail in order to gain that elevation within a reasonable grade. So that kind of roughly gives you an idea of what we're looking at for the cemetery alignment in our recommendation. I'll get into the high school alignment when we get into the east segment of the recommended alignment. So we recognized very early on in speaking to the committee and hearing from townspeople and town staff that there's certainly a real desire to make connections to various destinations throughout the town. The MBTA station, of course, because the path, which is now under construction, that's sort of a given. The state parks, the high school and the middle school especially, but then also downtown. So in order to facilitate that, we looked at little spur links along different streets, and then came to the realization kind of collectively that perhaps what we need is to just have a full loop, that there is enough of a need in different areas and places to connect to, like Stone Park and the library area and the other businesses kind of in the core of downtown, that taking advantage of an old rail line around the Nyanza Cap. There is an old rail bed. It's one of the few places along the entire alignment where there's actually an old rail bed. So we want to take advantage of that and recommend the trail run along that rail bed to Magunko Road, and then make kind of a series of connections using on-street striped bike lanes mostly, and some shared lanes to provide the connection from the end of that rail line. So there's the green, it's an off-road portion, to then the cemetery. So I'll walk you through that as well. So one of the streets in which the sort of main on-road downtown loop connects through is Park Road. And you can see in the photo, you all know there's head-in parking on one side adjacent to Stone Park, and then just some parallel parking on the other side. Lots of room there, not a high volume. You have 36 feet of space at least to play with based on our dimensioning. So we looked at two different options to accommodate foot and bike traffic. The foot traffic pretty much would be on the adjacent sidewalk, although a new sidewalk there with curbs would probably be useful. But pedestrian traffic would be on the sidewalk, and then the two options would be to simply narrow the two-way lane in the center and put in bike lanes, or to narrow the lane, take the parking that's right now right up against Stone Park, the grass, and sort of move it 12 feet to the north. And that provides, in essence, sort of a two-way cycle track or bikeway along the edge of Stone Park, the north edge of Stone Park. So that allows the trail to connect from Magunko. There's a short little jog on Cherry, and then across Park. The trail alignment then kind of turns in order to access eventually Homer Avenue on Summer Street. Summer Street, you see from the image, the post office is over in here. There's some curbside parking just on one side, and it's a two-way street, and a narrow sidewalk and some wide curb cuts on one side. So there, again, we have two options. We like to provide options for these because we recognize that the town wants to look at these a little bit more detail, connect and get more opinions from adjacent property owners, businesses, et cetera, to see really what works for people. But one of our mantras here was to not touch parking. So in any of the alignments that you see here, for all intents and purposes, there is no loss of any on-street parking. So we know that's important, certainly on Summer Street with the post office adjacent. So our options to provide some bike facility without loss of parking. One option was to put a bike lane on one side and then a shared lane in the other side. And then the other option was to just narrow the lanes a bit and to take the 5-foot sidewalk and widen it to 10 feet on one side, so that the sidewalk became, in essence, the width of a more typical shared use path. So those were the two options to form that connection in order to then crossing Main Street to get to Homer Avenue. Homer Avenue is a 2-lane roadway, not a whole lot of traffic volume, not compared to, say, Main Street or Union Street, of course. So we wanted to leverage what are the modest traffic volumes there and provide provide an opportunity where the traffic flow basically remains as is between Main and Alden as two-way, but then to look at Homer between Alden and to the curb cut into a large parking lot adjacent to this commercial building, and look at the opportunity to make that a one-way street to provide space for bike lanes in both directions. So that was our recommendation here for Homer Ave. Again, I don't know if you can read this very diagrammatic map, but this is Main Street, and this is Alden Street, and this is Central, and this is Union, Chestnut. So just in this stretch would be a one-way portion with bike lanes in both directions. You can see how that comes out there. So the big question is, well, how would that then transition? If you have bike lanes in two directions, here's Alden, here's Main Street. So we're suggesting that this could be a one-way eastbound portion of Homer Avenue here, bike lanes in both directions, and then in this stretch, so that there's full access to the businesses and to and from Alden Street and the gas station here, that this two-way zone would have shared lane markings, perhaps enhanced as what we call greenback sharrows, where you see these in Somerville if you're ever there, and in Boston a few spots where you just have a panel of green with a bike symbol on top of it to really sort of emphasize the shared road nature of that for both bikes and cars. But it has no impact on the traffic flow or parking or anything. So that was the idea, to have that as a shared space in order to connect to Summer Street and to the bike lanes on that part of Homer. Yes, sir?
Yeah, wouldn't it be easier just to have sharrows on Park Street, Summer Street, and Homer Ave all the way, instead of having one way this way, one way bike lane on one side and a sharrow on the other side, just make both lanes sharrowed?
Short answer is yes, that would be easier. But what
Be
we're
less confusing to the drivers too. I mean, I'm a bike rider.
okay.
And
What we were trying to do in these recommendations, and certainly that's an option, that could always be the fallback on any of the on-street connections, is that you could put up signs to say this is part of the Upper Charles Trail, and you could put the shared lane markings. That's certainly a fallback. What we were trying to do here was at least provide some recommendations where we thought it would be appropriate to find some space for striped bike lanes to provide a facility that people beyond just the most experienced type cyclists would have a little higher level of comfort of actually doing the loop into downtown. So if most of this trail from end to end is going to be off-road, and we expect it's going to have a whole wide range of users, families, novice bicyclists, etc., we wanted to try to make the route through the downtown and part of that loop to be as comfortable as possible with some sort of dedicated facilities to try to encourage some of the more novice cyclists, the families, the kids, etc., to actually peel off and maybe come into downtown. So again, your suggestion is certainly possible as a drawback, but would be less likely, we believe, to draw more of the trail users into downtown and vice versa. So, okay, so that explains, thank you for the question. So that was our idea for Homer Avenue, which then would connect to Chestnut Street and bring you to the main entry of Wildwood Cemetery, which I already talked about, the route through the cemetery. And now we've kind of moved into the third of the three segments to the east as we're making our way to the Dyke Trail and to the east end of the alignment. So from end to end, and again, I'll especially the high school, I'll show you in a little more detail later, but we've kind of come up, moving east, we've come up the edge of the cemetery, we've wound around in order to get some elevation gain to get to the far end of the play fields next to the high school. So we're rounding the trail along the north edge of the softball field and the football field, sort of through this center area where there's already an existing path, I'll show you in a sec, and then to the Eversource easement with the high tension power lines that are there now, lots of space. Eversource certainly has a number of examples of trails within easements of Eversource's power lines. We've had some initial discussions with them, so we feel that there's some progress being made there. And the sense that it is unprecedented that this would be a good route to take the trail. So along the Eversource alignment to Cedar, a short jog on Cedar, and then connecting on a couple of local, very low volume streets. So the treatment really would just be signage and maybe some of those shared lane markings in order to sort of get to the Market Basket shopping plaza, where we kind of route around the Market Basket. We did look at an alternative of staying along the base of the power lines here. There's some real topographical and wetland challenges there. That wouldn't be impossible, but we feel that we have an alternate to use this local street to just have people walking on the sidewalk and riding their bikes on that low-volume street in order to get to the back of Market Basket, and then along a portion of Pond Lane to the Dyke Trail. So in a little more detail, the Ashland High School INSEAD, we've had a number of meetings with the town's school facilities director, with the principal, with the superintendent, and with the school committee. And there's some significant level of comfort with the idea of bringing the trail through or to the high school and then through a portion of their property so that there is access from both sides to the high school. I'll tell you about some of the issues in just a sec, but in terms of describing the alignment, we have the switchbacks here. We're running along this kind of wooded area on the north side of the softball field, the football field, and then up to these these are all existing paths all through here, and then behind the baseball field, then cutting through a wooded area, short stretch of wooded area to get to the cleared easement, Eversource easement with the power lines. So some of the key issues, though, that we're being very sensitive to, and of course in our meetings with the superintendent and the school committee, we know that there are things that will need to be paid attention to in any subsequent planning and design of the trail through the high school property, simply because of the sensitivity of having a public facility like that so close to a school. So, the images here, for those that haven't been back in the high school, this is sort of the main walking path between the baseball field to the left and the football field to the right. And this is a path coming from over here that would need to be widened a bit. All these would need to be widened by a few feet just to give a little more breathing room there. Because some of the key issues that will need to have some signage and some other elements, perhaps some trail markings to ensure that, especially in this little zone here where there's a lot of traffic, potential trail traffic with high school kids, and when there's events, parents walking with their kids. So we know that we want to ensure that bikes are going slowly as they're going through there, signage, perhaps some chicane-like gates to actually really discourage higher speeds. We also know, because of that traffic pattern of people on foot and on bike, we also know that the school committee and the high school itself is interested in some type of way in the design of the trail, that there's an opportunity to close the trail in the case of some emergency at the high school. There'd be some kind of gates somewhere along the alignment to really stop people from coming into the site in some kind of an emergency situation at the high school. So that's something that we're paying attention to. The parking issues, making sure that there's a part of the parking lot that's signed for trail users to do any kind of parking as a trailhead. And then the delineation of school property. I'd like to think that we probably don't need to have a security fence on both sides of this trail all the way from end to end. That probably wouldn't be necessary, but certainly some signage at frequent intervals that make it clear to the trail user that that's school property to their left and to their right, and they really should stay on the trail. So those were important issues that we heard from the school committee that we're taking very seriously in part of the recommendations report. Yeah, here's the mic here.
Did anyone in the school committee raise any concern in general about, someone not from this area using the trail to go in, do some vandalism or hurt someone, whatever? And, they're in and out on the bike path.
Yeah.
I thought that the school committee was not gonna be okay with the path coming right through the back.
Yeah, that issue came up. Certainly I think it's true that there is some concern. I think there is some concern that that is a possibility, but I think that they recognize that, trails are, public ways into the high school property, just like the roadways and driveways are, and that the likelihood of crime or any nefarious activities happening via people coming in and out on bikes isn't so much different than coming in and out on cars, by car, or even coming in on bike or on foot from East Union Street. So I think there was a sense of comfort that that wouldn't be such a huge problem. And also they recognize that, yes, perhaps that's a bit of an issue, but they really see the clear benefit here of the trail, not just to the community, overall, but as a route for more kids to be able to walk and bike to school, which, biking on East Union Street is pretty much, out of the question. And on a given day, there's only, 1 to 3 bikes we heard parked there, and there's a lot of bike racks. And a handful of kids, of course, walk or closer. But I think the school committee, again, sort of see this as an opportunity for more walking and biking connections. And there wasn't a huge level of concern about the security issue, although there is some, for sure. Yeah, question in the back.
Yeah, hi, thank you. I'm just wondering, have you guys actually spent some time over at the high school during the course of a day? Because at all different times of the day, there's a ton of traffic there, and there's also a lot of kids outside. And I would,
Yeah.
You need a quarry to go into the building, and to have a bike trail go right past like the prime parking area and the area where people are walking up to the football field, I'm a little nervous about
Yeah.
it being so close to where there's just
Yeah.
tons of kids outside. There are tables out back there too for the kids to sit outside. And
Yeah.
I
Well,
just
In terms of the traffic congestion and potential of collisions,
and safety for my I have kids there, two
Yep.
14-year-old girls that
Yep.
are there, and I'm just a little nervous.
okay. Well, I think there's safety, I guess, related to like collisions of people on bike with children as sort of the first issue, and then I guess there's just overall security, which I guess the gentleman earlier had sort of asked roughly a similar question, which I think I've addressed to some degree. But in terms of the collision issue, I mean, the good news here is, the use of a trail system like this in a community like this, I think everyone probably would agree, it will be clearly heaviest on weekends. And we know that there occasionally are events, certainly at the school, at the fields. And I guess, maybe, I don't know for a fact if there's events actually in the school on the weekends, but most of the trail use will be on weekends. There certainly will be some late afternoon and summers, but, during school days, there's gonna, to be honest, there's gonna not be very much traffic, either walking or biking traffic on the trail during your typical school day, like there will be on a weekend. So I think that sort of mitigates the concern about a lot of kids hanging out, walking up and down those trails and having someone on a bike, and the potential for a collision there. And again, I think the issue of security, I think that, all schools take security very seriously, as I assume Ashland High School does, with regards to people coming in and out of the building, vehicles coming in and out. But the reality is this is one more public access way into the high school property that, is used for people walking and on bike. And right now, again, if someone really had, the wrong reason to be on school property, they could always just do that now. So I think a lot of the school committee members, as we in our experience as consultants, have felt that it trails adjacent to schools or adjacent to people's homes and neighborhoods, and lots of studies show it does not lead to an increase in any sort of crime. So, but I can understand, certainly, I have a high school child myself, an elementary school kid. I know that that's always a concern of parents about, strangers coming onto a school property. Okay, so I'm gonna move forward, and I'm gonna try to finish in about 10 more minutes, and then we'll have sort of a nice, clear half hour for lots of open discussion. So moving, let's see, I don't think I talked about this. So through the high school to the Eversource easement, which I talked about, that Eversource easement then continues to Cedar and beyond. Beyond, it starts getting really close to some of the homes on the opposite side of Cedar. So this was a good opportunity for us to actually swing the trail to the north, just one short block with a short pass segment, and then have a new crossing of Cedar Street to Mulhall Drive, which again is a low-volume residential street. There would just be sort of shared use of bicycles and cars within that roadway, and even at such a low volume that even for the beginner cyclists and families, generally that low-volume residential street works well. That I described a little bit earlier, kind of winds around, gets to the Market Basket. The grocery store itself is about there. So the route would come around the corner of the building like this. We've had some preliminary discussion with Market Basket. What our recommendation is to actually reconfigure the far west, southwest edge of the parking lot so that the last aisle of parking, instead of being head-in parking, becomes angled parking, which does mean the loss of perhaps 3 or 4 spaces total, but that provides space for a narrower drive aisle and then for the path to come through on its own little right-of-way through there, through the far edge of the parking lot. So that's those are in discussion with Market Basket. We're hoping that works out well. There is a backup alternative to sort of go back behind these properties, but there's some real challenges there, additional costs, wetlands and such. What we're trying to connect to is to Pond Street, and which routes 126. Or is that 135? 126. Yeah, 126, thank you. 126, and MassDOT has a redesign plan that accommodates the trail nicely. The MassDOT plan has, bike lanes and a narrow sidewalk on each side from end to end, except where the Upper Charles Trail is anticipated to come in at the shopping plaza to the Dyke Trail, where the sidewalk on the west side would be a 10-foot sidewalk. So cyclists who are more beginner, novice, families who don't necessarily want to be on striped bike lanes on that really busy, high-volume, high-speed road could actually be on a 10-foot path adjacent to it, which would look kind of like this. So again, there's bike lanes for real experienced cyclists. Maybe on a weekend when there's not much traffic, might just jump in the bike lane and ride either to the Dyke Trail or perhaps just continue further south. But there is that path there on the side that we're incorporating what's already in MassDOT's design. We do have a small bulleted list of some additional recommendations that we think could make it an even better facility. That's in the report, but generally we wanted to take advantage of that. And then an enhanced crossing at Pond Street to get to the Dyke Trail, which goes out about 3/4 of a mile and then basically ends at the Sherburne line. So I kind of walked you through, in essence, end to end. Again, point A, which was Hopkinen State Park, to the end of the Dyke Trail at the Sherburne line, where the rail line and the rail yard is at the Sherburne line. And of course, and someone brought up the question about sort of the character, the look, and the feel. So I just want to take you through the different, the sort of toolbox of design options, of different character options for the trail. One of which, of course, is a paved trail, asphalt paved, 10 feet wide, which is pretty much the standard the standard width that accommodates federal and state standards of 10 feet. Having as you can see, some sort of stone dust or a soft shoulder on each side tends to be popular with runners, so that's always a good feature to include. So certainly a significant part of the trail will look a little more like this. But then other areas where in a bit more environmentally sensitive zones or places where there's just the desire for a more naturalistic character, we still want to maintain that 10-foot width, but in terms of having more landscaping closer to the edge of the trail and having more of a stone dust surface rather than the hard asphalt would be the recommendation in some stretches as well. There are a few areas, such as along the MBTA access road, under construction now, along a short portion of Whittemore Drive, along a short portion of Cedar, and along Pond Street, that section I just described, where the trail may look something more like this. which is called a side path, where you have a path, in essence, within a roadway right-of-way that's immediately adjacent, with some buffer that's at least a few feet wide, or to have a crash barrier if you don't have the width to have a nice landscape buffer between. So there'll be a few discrete segments, primarily the MBTA access road, that will look more like this with the side path. There, of course, will be boardwalk segments. We've already talked about, the primary big one is going to be along Cold Spring Brook and at the north end of Ashland State Park. But there's, 3 or 4 other areas where you'll have some shorter segments of boardwalk that might run between 50 and perhaps a couple hundred feet in length. And then finally, in some areas where we know we're either on public or private land, and in places where we're close to homes, that there's recommendations, it's part of the plan for having vegetated buffers and fences, just to provide more of a visual screen. There's ways to do it, especially when you play around with the grade or the topography a little bit, to create berms. So it isn't just about putting some hedges and trees, which could work okay, but there's also ways that you could actually lower, if in this diagram, if the original grade was that dashed line, you could actually lower the grade of the trail a little bit. Have to look at drainage carefully, of course, and take some of that cut material and sort of create a berm to create even more of a visual screen. So there are opportunities, and there'll be a few. There's really only about 10 or 12 individual properties that the trail even comes close to. Again, most of this, about 60%, is on public land or within public rights-of-way, or through larger privately owned parcels where there really is no impact to any adjacent properties. So this would just be in a handful of discrete areas. And then road crossings. I described a number of spots where there would just be a road crossing, and it would, we'd want, especially the busier streets like Howe Street, High Street, the crossing at Cedar, those 3 especially, where we'd want to have a little more than just a striped crosswalk and some signage. So our recommendations are at all those locations that there be installed a what's called an RRFB, or rectangular rapid flashing beacon, which is very similar to what's been installed on the crosswalk in front of the library here in town. So that gives the opportunity for someone coming up on bike or on foot to press the button and have those beacons rapidly flashing to help warn motorists of someone crossing. Oh, Chestnut was another key location at the entry to Wildwood Cemetery, where this is recommended as well. So our next steps, that's the tour from end to end in 75 minutes. And just to kind of finish off the next steps, because our role, our consultant team's role, Alta Planning and Design with Kleinfelder, and the work that we've done with the committee and the town is coming to a close. Our contract's coming to a close. It's been a great project for us, and we are completing the plan. And part of that plan will include more of an implementation recommendations section at the end that spells out next steps in a bit more detail, but to kind of summarize them here, formally adopting the study, I think, is important, whether that be the Board of Selectmen or the different, the Planning Board, I assume, will need to weigh in and formally adopt this in some way. Different boards and commissions, typically, with a town or a city, will formally adopt a plan. That's important. And then, starting right away on trying to secure the trail right of way. As I've said multiple times, this isn't sort of a simple old rail bed where it's perhaps one property owner, a railroad, or one other property owner, or the state sometimes owns those rail lines. These are multiple properties. We have a whole appendix section that lists all the properties. What is there, Charlie, 30 or so? What? I think 31. 31. Joel says 23, Charlie says 31, so let's say 26. 26 properties from end to end that will need to be secured in terms of the trail right of way. Part of that's going to mean continued outreach with DCR, which I described is already happening. MassDOT, coordination with them, mostly on the Union Street and the Pond Street, and making sure that any crossing or trail alignments along those two streets, that there's some coordination with them. There's, of course, a number of key property owners and/or Eversource that doesn't own that property but has that easement. And so there's that negotiation that has already started, will need to continue. And then the coordination amongst town committees, Conservation Commission, of course, is a key one, and the Planning Board, Board of Selectmen, and others. And our recommendation, and I'm sure Joel is just thrilled to continue to be the Upper Charles Trail champion, and that the committee itself continue to be the champion that promotes the trail, that is talking it up, that goes to farmers markets, and shows people maps and takes additional comments. And I think that's a role the committee has played very well, and we hope will continue. And perhaps sprouting out from that committee would be a nonprofit. A lot of towns will establish a 501c3 nonprofit that could actually do fundraising in a more efficient way than just a simple town committee. The wetland issues and looking into the delineation of wetlands and sort of starting pretty quickly on understanding the permitting challenges is a key recommendation. And then understanding in this 8-mile segment that is unlikely to be funded and built in one stretch is to really have a sense for a phasing strategy. And that's something that we've developed, as you can see in those diagrams. I won't get into the details. We've developed sort of 3 strategies for how to phase the project. One that sort of involves kind of building off of the route through the 2 state parks as sort of the beginning of the Upper Charles Trail in Ashland and sort of building from there. Another one is kind of looking at that downtown and Ashland State Park loop as the sort of the core of phase 1. And when that's complete, then sort of building out from there. And then another is just specifically to focus in on the town or the properties and rights of way that are already controlled by the town and move forward on parts of the trail there, those that are least contiguous. So those are the key next steps. And you will have the first question, sir, but before I give that to you, say thank you, but also to remind you of the webpage for the project, where at some point next week you'll be able to access a draft of the final report in PDF format, and also where you can submit any additional comments on the email contact button there too. So I thank you very much, and your question, sir.
Yes, I just,
Microphone's coming.
I know that the distance was mentioned as 8.3 miles with an approximate cost of $1 million a mile.
Yep.
Does the 8.3 miles, does that include the full loop? Does it include the offshoot to the MBTA and the middle school, or what part of the 8.3 is what part of the trail?
The 8.3 includes the loop into downtown, but does not include the north half of the MBTA access road that provides a nice spur to the station itself. But that's not included in that mileage total.
In looking at the larger map of the trail across the town, have you identified locations where you think you're going to put in parking areas and facilities?
That's a good question. That is still in process. But we know we definitely want to look at, we know for sure there's some givens there. Like one of the things that we thought was really advantageous to connect where we want to connect at Hopkinton State Park, as we felt, and DCR was supportive of this, that people would actually park there and actually use the trail, and there are facilities there. So we know that would be a primary trailhead, and we're still analyzing additional spots where, specifically parking could be, signed and or designated for trail use. There are some that will just by, again, default, like for instance, the parking along the edge of Stone Park, along Park Road in Stone Park. Unless there's a big event in Stone Park, generally there's available spaces there. So that would be one, whether it gets actually signed as, this is, trailhead for the Upper Charles Trail or not, I'm not sure, but that would be another opportunity as well. And although we want to be careful about what we're promoting or encouraging during school days, but on weekends, there's certainly lots of parking available at the high school as well. So, but in terms of other discrete areas, we'll still need to look at that.
I asked just because we do abut that area, and I think parking and where parking is going to be will drive support for that to a certain extent, at least for
Yep.
those of us that are living right on the trail.
And where are you, near which part of the trail?
Whittemore Drive.
Okay.
So the town land, where you're looking at that access road, goes
Yep.
right next to our house, and I know it's town land behind there, so I'm just interested
Yeah,
in, given the size of space there, if I should brace myself for a parking lot.
yeah. Well, I think, you know, if someone, that's close enough to Hopkinton State Park that I would think if someone really wants to do sort of the end-to-end, that they would, you know, there'd be a higher likelihood of them wanting to probably start at the actual ends. But yeah, but that's certainly an important consideration. Yeah.
Phil, you mentioned that your work is coming to a close, and so based on the information that you've provided tonight and based on the draft, and I've had an opportunity to review the draft prior to tonight, how do you recommend that the town evaluate the alternatives that are available? And I'll point to just one example, which would be in the west section, where you have the recommended route that you described, but there is a route that comes in on a more southerly point that connects to Hopkinton that scores very close to the same number as the recommended. So again, I don't want to argue or dispute the virtues of either one. It's just how do we best as a community determine the alternatives and in terms of viabilities, in terms of the cost as well.
Yeah. Well, we stand in essence by our recommendation. And I think what you're describing are sort of the larger recommendations of connecting from like Hopkinton State Park to Ashland State Park. And we certainly had one option that went sort of deeper into Hopkinton and looped around and connected to the state park really closer to here. And I think that's the one you're referring to.
That's correct.
Yep. So in our scoring and then in further, again, as I said, it wasn't just about the scoring, it was also other analysis and discussion with the town and the committee. The recommendation was to create more of a direct link through the town of Ashland, where the sense was there was a higher level of control about what the town could do if this was a trail that I think most people on the committee and many that we heard from are happy to connect to other towns. But in terms of doing a trail within Ashland, having a large portion, if not 100% of the trail within the town boundaries actually helps to create a little bit more predictability for making it work. So there was some, I think that played a role as well. So based on the evaluation and those other factors, it is our recommendation that the recommended route be followed. However, we do understand that with the Big Head Indian Reservation, that's a significant private parcel. It may not be a slam dunk to actually route the trail through that particular parcel. So we do have shorter sub-options in order to avoid that potential. But other than those sub-options, in order to avoid the Indian Reservation property, it's our recommendation that that overall route be followed as the recommendation.
Understood. I'm not questioning your recommendation.
Yeah, okay.
I'm asking, how would we best evaluate the options with the data that you've derived? So I'm sure there's more data that you have that you could provide us as part of your work product that will give us an opportunity to evaluate those options.
Now, when you say those options, you mean the option that loops around through Hopkinton, right? Or are you talking about the sub-options around the Indian Reservation property?
Well, that would be the start point, that western section, and you've got two options that are two alternatives that are available. And again, I'm just asking, as someone that will probably be evaluating and having a lot of conversations, how do we best evaluate
Yeah.
all of this?
I should probably point out so people know what you're talking about, because I know not everyone's been to all 3 meetings. So I think generally what Steve is referring to is one of the early routes, or one of the optional routes we looked at earlier on in the process. Went from Hopkinton State Park and sort of connected through a part of Hopkinton along Legacy Farms Road, where there's a path that's been built recently. So we took advantage of that, crossed East Union, and then sort of went through sort of a mix of streets and private properties and a few rail rights of way in order to get to Hopkinton or Ashland State Park in this direction. So it was a loop that was kind of more like that. So that's the loop that Steve is referring to, that we evaluated this one versus roughly this one. It's taken a few little twists and turns. And again, based on the scoring and some of the other factors, this was the recommendation. So I guess it's always the town's prerogative as you move forward to disregard some of the recommendations that we've made here or perhaps elsewhere, and do some additional digging and further analysis to determine if that's really is the right, if the alternate is truly the right one. The cost estimate we've done is just for our recommendation. So, we don't have a cost estimate necessarily to compare this to this one, only just more of a really very high level sort of gut sense in the evaluation, where we gave, the criterion of cost and engineering challenges scored at a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. But other than that, we don't have a price for it. So, but. Oh, thank you. Yeah. That was another issue Joel reminded me of. When we met with DCR, we did talk about the various options. They were very open and supportive to incorporating this kind of access, sort of dirt road here. There's another one that goes off in this direction that they were somewhat open to as well, but they really did not like the idea because they were more kind of hiking trails through here, much narrower. That would require a lot more felling of trees and more disturbance to the land. So DCR did not like that route option through the state park too. So that would be an additional challenge to overcome in re-looking at that more southerly loop. Yeah, you and then somewhere in the front.
Yeah, hi.
Oh.
Me?
Yeah, you. Yep,
So
sorry.
what about using the rail bed? How wide is the railroad's right of way? And I mean, because that goes from the state park on one corner all the way through town. It's flat.
Yeah, so you're talking about the railroad
Yeah.
here. Yeah, we look carefully at the railroad alignment really between, not so much out in here because we thought that was taking us kind of a little too far to the northwest, but we looked at from the station to basically a point where you could connect to the cemetery here. And we determined that there just wasn't really the space, given the needs of railroads like the MBTA to have a wide buffer and the fencing and having some available space for their maintenance vehicles to come up and down. So we looked at it and determined it didn't really work.
What about further west where there's, I mean, if you get bunged up at the Indian campground or whatever, I mean, there'd certainly be less people to deal with, if you could do it.
Yeah. Yeah, so you're suggesting if, none of these work, we could somehow get through the state park and then run along the rail line like that.
Right.
Yeah, it's certainly something, we did not fully evaluate that, to be honest, but it's something to look at. But again, there's the concern of getting sort of a little further afield from the ultimate goal of kind of connecting with Hopkinton and sort of forming the big loop. So you're just starting to get a little bit, far out of the way. So that's just one concern is all. But certainly a reasonable idea.
Yeah, it probably, I mean, you're most concerned, the abutters are already stuck with a train, so.
Yeah, that's a good point.
You're not cutting through such a deep residential area, which, you know, I know, and like the Boy Scout camp, they like their woods and stuff. I mean, I think you could do it, but it certainly would seem to be a lot less people involved if you could take a chunk of that. Even if you had spur lines off it or something.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And Charlie, did you have a comment before I kind of jumped? You seem,
Two things.
yep.
One was that there was some pretty major concern about.
Oh, do you want to grab the mic, please?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
How's that? Is that a little better? There was some major concern from the last route that we recommended or that we were talking about in terms of crossing Olive Street. It's a very narrow right-of-way with sort of an embankment on both sides, very little room to widen that roadway. And in fact, the neighborhoods around Olive Street, not only was it difficult to cross, but it was difficult to find a town-owned parcel with a proper crossing location. It involved going down a route that we deemed would be likely unsafe and unpopular. So that was for the last question. In terms of the most recent question about MBTA, in looking at trail projects on other MBTA lands, it appears that they want to keep some of their options open. Whether or not this ever happens, I don't know, but they like to have the space to be able to create new rails so they can park trains in
Sidings.
emergency
Sidings, basically, yeah.
situations. Yeah, that's right.
One other comment on the MBTA, and also, I know the MBTA now owns out to Worcester, but CSX still runs freight trains into Framingham and out. And if you ever seen a train going down the road, maybe especially lumber trains with a shifted load where the straps come off, you have one of those wire straps bumping around on the roadbed, and it happens to go over into the rail trail, you're open to a lot of liability. So, and also the west part, west of House Street, the Sudbury River's there, and it gets kind of wet, and there's arch bridges, there's wetlands up in that area. So that's all I have to say to address that.
Thank you. 2 other questions here. Yes, sir.
My concern is on the eastern end.
Okay.
My understanding is that it dead ends there because, CTX still owns the rail.
CSX, yep.
CSX still owns the property.
Yeah, yeah. Town of Sherburne has been trying to get CSX to budge and to provide an easement for them to build a portion of their trail, and they've been unsuccessful so far. There's certainly examples of other communities that have banged their head against the wall for many years, dealing with the railroads, and sometimes things change, so there's always the possibility, and we certainly hope that that will work out at some point. We did look at and recognize that that is a challenge, sort of longer term, for Sherburne to actually create a portion of the trail that sort of runs parallel with the rail line. We looked at a number of different examples early on, or different options, I should say, where we actually, took the trail route further on Pond Street and made some connections on Elliott and some of these others in order to kind of get closer to Holliston. And there's a whole lot of really, this is all wetland areas, so we're trying to avoid some of that. The roadways and the need to take a left off of Pond Street to cross over didn't really work out. The Dyke Trail, people really like the Dyke Trail. It's sort of a nice feature, even though it does dead end, and we didn't want to just bypass that. So the decision was made collectively amongst the team, including the committee, that the Dyke Trail is there, people are out there and they walk, and it's a dead end for sure, that we could perhaps enliven it a little by having perhaps a small observation tower, a small little parklet out there, even just a picnic table, observation tower you can actually get up and get a view over things, could be sort of interesting. So
Okay.
that was the recommendation.
Okay.
And we know it's not ideal.
My understanding is
Yeah.
that Sherburne does own up to Whitney Street?
Whitney Street's down here.
Right, so
Yep.
what are the chances of running that down to connect with Sherborne and connect with Holliston.
It sounds like we have an answer behind you.
So I am part of the Metro West Regional Collaborative, which is an organization that is Board of Selectmen and planning members from 9 communities. It is also part of MAPC, which is a big regional planning committee. And we are actually in the process on October 26th. There's going to be a kickoff at Cochituate in Natick for the Metro West landline. And it is looking at the connections between some of these pieces that are being done. So Holliston has their portion. This landline is going to look at how can they connect Holliston into Sherborne, into what we're doing in Framingham, and then also up into what we're doing in Ashland, and then up into Framingham, and then also longer and further out from Framingham into Marlborough and some of these other places. So we here in Ashland are looking at just the Ashland portion, but these regional planning organizations are looking at, okay, how can we help the communities connect what they're doing? I also know as part of that, that Holliston has their part that's going up into Sherborne, but they also have a part that they would like to do almost more directly into our state park that they've started looking at. Nothing has been drawn or anything. So we're working on Ashland, but these regional planning organizations are looking at how we can help connect all these other things. Yeah, so that's October 26th. I don't know the time, but we can get that information out to people.
And where is that again?
It's going to be, I believe, at the Cochituate State Park in Framingham, Natick, where Natick just is starting some really major construction on their route that goes into downtown Natick. They have some funding to do that.
Terrific.
Just an overall comment. I'm brand new to Ashland, so I'm excited to see the town investing in something that, to be perfectly honest, I'll probably run every day. So I'm excited about that. This is probably one of the craziest maps I've ever seen, and I've been in Portland, Oregon, and Iowa City, and all over the place, done bicycle planning. So props to you guys for putting something together. 20 years from now, if this gets done, it's nice to have in town. It's going to be a hodgepodge of all kinds of various things. So I'm excited that we're doing something, but I'm just concerned about the price tag for something that is very niche, meaning it has so many road crossings and so many changes and so many topography things that the price tag for that type of environment might outweigh the benefits long-term of a bike access area. Yes, it's great trail access for the town, but incorporating bike facilities for the entire route might be extremely cost prohibitive compared to working on adding bike lanes across town, adding sidewalks, etc. I'm excited to see the town investing in trails, but compared to other cost benefits of other places in town, this might be extremely cost prohibitive comparative to other ones.
So in regards to your talking about bike lanes and things like that, we are a complete streets community, which means as we move forward with the planning and any redesigning and working on our streets, we are in the process of trying to start including that complete streets component, meaning if there's a road, like when they just did Chestnut Street, there wasn't a lot of room there, but they did try to narrow it a little bit so that when they striped it in certain places, you'll notice that the right-hand stripe is a little further in. Certainly not a bike lane, but those are the kinds of little things. And then certainly with Route 126, we've been working with the state. That'll be complete streets. That'll have all the bike lanes. And then long-term, as a community, we have to sort of push and decide if the bike lanes are things that we want, that we need to make sure that they're done.
And I think we all pay, state and federal taxes too. It isn't just local, but, the big high-ticket items here are in all likelihood will be paid and funded through MassDOT, through federal transportation grants and state transportation grants. So I'm not going to say that that's not tax money, because it is, but it's highly unlikely that a significant chunk, I think there's some portions perhaps, but that a large chunk of the funds for this trail are going to be found through local coffers. Yeah.
So once the trail is built, how does the trail ultimately get maintained? Does it become the town of Ashland's responsibility to pass through trash removal and security and trail maintenance, or is that part of the initial money that is raised up front?
Typically the maintenance, that's where the local funds are typically used for more of the maintenance of the facility. However, portions of this are going to be on state property. So there's certainly partnership opportunities, clearly with DCR primarily. And MassDOT would, maintain any facilities along their roadways as well. So it wouldn't be exclusively the town's DPW's purview. Yeah. Yep. Oh, yes. Yeah, a lot. Milford and many other communities will have, trail cleanup days. I know even, I mentioned before, I live in Arlington. The Minuteman Path is extremely popular and it's reasonably well maintained, but even despite that, because it is so popular, all the communities, Bedford, Lexington, and Arlington, probably twice a year, we have, community cleanup days as well, and that's something that frequently just needs to be done to, supplement the maintenance work that's done and paid for locally. Any other questions? We got like 10 more minutes. Yeah, well, I'm going to give Rob the last word, but one last question then, and if the microphone could be handed over to this gentleman. Thank you.
So is there any rough timeline, like when some part would be completed?
Well, the one timeline that we're pretty sure of or positive of is the first little stretch, which is the MBTA access road, because it's under construction. And that will be done, I assume, sometime next spring, or maybe by the end of this year, I'm not sure. Mike, do you know? Mike's involved in that project. But
it's getting close.
a few, yeah, before the end of the year. So that's a piece of the trail that will be done. That will be nice. Literally no other stretch of this is funded at this moment. But certainly there are segments, some segments that are far less expensive than others, some segments that can be changed just with restriping of roadway, for instance, and some signage that could be done more quickly than others. But certainly, the portions that are going to be, through the state park, especially that involve boardwalks, is going to be a handful of years, for sure. But, the phasing strategy will play a role as well. If the phasing, I mentioned in that last slide, the kind of phasing strategies, that one, if the kind of key strategy is to start, the red was phase one, really start on working with DCR immediately and kind of creating a loop, then, it's going to take a while to raise the funds to get the permitting for, a 2,500 foot long stretch of boardwalk. But it will happen certainly a bit quicker than if that is a phase two or a phase three. So I know that the committee felt very strongly about, that the portion of the trail through Ashland State Park was really critical. And that even though the on-street bike facilities in the downtown portion of the loop are nice, they don't provide that sort of off-road amenity that families and more novice cyclists would feel comfortable on. So that's sort of critical to get that moving, but that will be a few years for sure. So yeah, Tony's going to have a quick word, make an announcement. What? No, okay. Oh, okay. Yes. Okay. The other portion of the trail that is in essence done or will soon be done, the Dyke Trail, which is an existing facility and will soon be improved with a cleanup that's going to happen relatively soon, Tony tells me. Okay, so with that, I thank you very much, and we're going to give the last word to Selectman Scheer.
Thank you. I did want to take this opportunity to thank Phil and Charles from Alta and Kleinfeld, the representative Mike there. So we've worked with them for the past 9 months. So thank you for your efforts. So I know there's a lot of challenges. Do I get just a hint of excitement out there about this field and about the possibilities? All right, thank you. Very nice, thank you. So there's been some really great comments, and, you know, I just, one of the things I wanted to highlight, you know, this is, nothing's cast in stone here. I see this personally as kind of an organic process where we look at what the landowners and the abutters want, and maybe as Phil talked about, the trail would shift depending where it is, you know, depending on its impact and the other needs. So it's still, you know, very much a work in progress, but I'm excited. I know Joel and the rest of the committee is, and I do want to take this opportunity just to introduce members of the committee. I forgot to do that earlier. Tony Lewis is here. Rick Hampson. Of course, Joel. Is Valerie still here? Did she had to leave? But really quite a big, hard-working group, and I probably can't name them all at the moment. So, but I'll hit the ones that are here. So, anyway, so I did want to just thank you all for coming out, and you know, Phil went over the kind of the follow-ups we're going to do, and so hopefully onward and upward with this. Oh, I did want to say to the gentleman's question about the cost, and you know, this is something, as I said, we're very cognizant of. And I do see it as an organic process where we get funding, we decide how we want to do each phase. I do want to say one thing, if you could see a picture of that dike trail, it's really a beautiful spot. If you haven't been out there, it's really underutilized. So, you know, that's a great thing. So thank you all for coming out, and look forward to more work on this.